Welcome to A Popular History of Unpopular Things, a mostly scripted podcast that makes history more fun and accessible. My kind of history is the unpopular stuff: disease, death, and destruction. I like learning about all things bloody, gross, mysterious, and weird. Now, before we begin, a quick reminder to support me on Patreon. There are lots of awesome exclusives you can only find there, like bonus episodes and tier lists and more, and your support helps ensure that the podcast can keep going. Click the Patreon link in the description to check it out. And AFOUT is also on YouTube, so if you're watching this on YouTube now, awesome! Don't forget to hit that subscribe button below so you can get more content. And now, on with the show. Today, we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics: cannibalism. Did you know that you can get diseases from eating other humans? Today's episode is going to be all about Kuru, a rare and incurable disease transmitted through the consumption of contaminated brain tissue. And it's not just any contaminated brain tissue, mind you, but brains that are filled with damaged prions, proteins found in the brain. You may have heard of prion diseases before, things like mad cow disease, which is the colloquial or more commonly known version of bovine spongiform encephalitis. Mad cow disease can and has been transmitted to humans, and our version is called Creutzfeldt-Jakob Disease, CJD. And if you pay attention to the news, another prion disease is going around Yellowstone right now in populations of elk and deer: chronic wasting disease. Sheep and goats can get prion diseases too. We call that scrapie. And don't you worry, we're going to talk about all of that stuff today. And for good measure, we'll throw in some Algonquin American indigenous mythology too, because I want to talk about Wendigos, evil spirits that are said to possess humans and turn them into cannibals. So let's dive into the diseases that mess with our minds and kill cannibals. Now, for those of you who are seasoned AFAL veterans by this point, you know that we usually start off the show with historical context. Context is always important. It's the background information needed to understand the topic. How and why does this topic even exist, right? For example, in the last episode, I covered the Inca mummies, which meant we needed to understand how and why the Inca came to exist, and what about their culture led them to sacrifice young children and leave their bodies to mummify on the tops of mountains. Well, this week, to properly understand Kuru, we first need to talk about the Fore people of Papua New Guinea and how they contracted the disease in the first place. Papua New Guinea is a sovereign nation that makes up the eastern half of the island of New Guinea. It's located north of Australia, and it's part of Oceania, just to give you some geographic context there. So, the other side of the world, at least for where most of you guys who are watching this are located. Now, in the 1930s, Australian gold prospectors went digging around on the island of New Guinea and ran into roughly 1 million people living up in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. Prior to this, nobody really knew anyone lived up there. So we're talking about a population of uncontacted indigenous peoples who lived in the millions, or rather numbered in the millions. The land itself had changed hands a bunch of times before this in the age of imperialism, but the indigenous peoples more or less kept to themselves. And so they had their own cultural and religious practices that developed in isolation. And they are super different from your traditional Afro-Eurasian practices. And though there are countless tribes and family groups, we're going to focus on the Fore people, the ones who developed Kuru. In the 1950s, researchers and anthropologists, those who study human cultures, societies, and beliefs, came across a group of around 11,000 Fore indigenous people. For anthropologists, a huge score, big victory, right? A new, relatively uncontacted group, a chance to see how indigenous peoples lived without access to modern technology or the combined knowledge and advancements of the connected world. It's like looking back in time to see how our earliest ancestors lived. It's amazing stuff. Now, before I go on, there is a risk to contacting isolated tribes. For any of you budding anthropologists out there, you risk spreading modern diseases. If an isolated group of people have never seen outsiders before, they've never interacted with anyone outside of their family and kinship groups, then they don't have tolerance or immunity to a whole host of diseases that we've been spreading back and forth since we formed agricultural settlements around 9,000 years ago. Okay? I mean, smallpox was never in the New World until after the Europeans came and took over, and it's responsible, like I said in the last episode, for knocking out somewhere between 50 and 90% of all indigenous American populations, although the modern estimates are 50 to 80%, but still. It's the primary reason why the Inca and the Aztec fell. And even today, isolated tribes are still at risk of death and annihilation because of this lack of immunity. Short side tangent. Sorry. I'm not sorry. Now, in Brazil, there are at least 114 isolated groups living in the vast Amazon jungle, though we can only confirm the continued existence, I should say, of about 28 of those groups. Now, one guy became pretty famous. He didn't really know about his fame, of course, because he stayed isolated, but he became famous because he was the last man left of his tribe, the Tanaru. We kept tabs on this guy. We don't know his name, but we called him Man of the Hole because he dug a lot of holes. The Tanaru were mostly wiped out between the 1970s and the 1990s by Brazilian settlers taking his lands. Man of the Hole was the only survivor of the tribe, and he went deeper into the forest to continue living out his life. He built over 50 huts, and after he abandoned each hut, researchers would find a deep hole there. Though he didn't have direct contact with outsiders, Brazil's indigenous government agency called FUNAI would leave him seeds and tools, stuff like that. So he was vaguely aware of the presence of people helping him, but he chose to live isolated in the forest. In 2018, drone footage was published showing him alone maintaining his village. The idea was to spread awareness of the dangers that uncontacted indigenous groups face. Sadly, he was found dead in 2022, lying in his hammock, adorned with feathers, seemingly awaiting death. A sad, lonely life, and with his death, so too died another indigenous group. But the Fore in Papua New Guinea, they're still alive and kicking. Their numbers are estimated at around 20,000 today. But this little side story is another example of the dangers facing uncontacted groups. Disease and conflict can devastate isolated peoples. Okay, I'm sorry. That was a bit bigger of a tangent than I normally do. But I find this stuff really fascinating, that there are still groups out there that are uncontacted, but we can't even learn too much about them because we'll kill them. That's just so fascinating and tragic. So, when the Fore were first contacted by anthropologists in the 1950s, the researchers were, of course, careful not to spread diseases. But influenza had already swept over most of the country, so they were slightly less susceptible to modern diseases that would ravage those like Man of the Hole. But it wasn't the external diseases that outsiders brought in that plagued them. It was a disease local only to the Fore peoples, and it was called Kuru. Kuru, also colloquially known as laughing sickness, was killing off around 200 Fore people a year. The symptoms included muscle twitching, involuntary muscle spasms, loss of coordination, and difficulty walking. So, a lot of neurological stuff, right? Behavioral and mood changes, hallucination, and a rapid onset of dementia. Someone suffering from Kuru also had difficulty eating, which means they also usually suffered from malnutrition. There is no cure. It is 100% fatal, and you usually die within a year of contracting it. Now, for all my hypochondriacs out there panicking and checking WebMD right now because you forgot what you ate for breakfast, hold your horses, okay? There's only one way to get Kuru, and it's consuming diseased human brain tissue. That's it. So unless you're cannibalizing the brain of someone infected with a Prion disease, which is a very specific set of circumstances, you're not going to get Kuru. So let's go into the science of that real quick. I want to understand more about how prions are related to the brain and how they can get all wibbly and damaged, and ultimately how only the Fore were the ones contracting it. Prions are organisms that are made up of proteins. The problem with prions is that they can cause normal brain proteins to fold over in weird ways. You may think, who cares? Let the protein fold if it wants, man. It's 2024. But you see, the problem with these abnormally folded proteins in the brain is that they're mutations. And to oversimplify things and make it easier to understand for the non scientific audience, they cause two big problems. First, they trigger other proteins to start folding over in weird ways. And second, these growing number of clumped proteins accumulate and smush together, getting in the way of normal operations up there, which causes brain cells to die off. And that's gotta be just like the worst X-Men mutation. No superpowers here, just death. Now, I wish I could tell you more about the science of misfolded prions, but honestly, the scientific community just doesn't know a crazy amount about prion diseases. And since prion diseases are fatal and progress rapidly, it's not like we can study them in a single patient over a long period of time. Now, can your brain proteins just start folding weirdly out of nowhere? Not usually, no. There are three main factors. First, you have a family history of prion disease, meaning it's congenital. You're born with it. It's a genetic mutation that is passed down to you. Two, you've eaten meat that has misfolded prions in it, like beef from a cow infected with mad cow disease. More on that in a bit. Three, you've got an infection from contaminated corneal tissue implants. That's cornea, as in the clear outer layer of your eyeballs, or perhaps contaminated medical equipment during said procedure. How do you find out you've got a prion disease? Well, since it impacts the brain, you just need to get a sample of brain tissue, a biopsy. You can also get a spinal tap, and that sounds awful and terrifying. Plus, spinal taps hurt, pain dialed all the way up to 11. You can also examine brain tissue post mortem after death during an autopsy, but that doesn't help you cure it. Now, we'll come back to Kuru and cannibalism in a bit, but first, I want to talk about some of the other prion diseases out there. Let's start with mad cow disease. Bovine spongiform encephalitis affects cows, and it is a result of these misfolded proteins. It was first noticed in cows in the UK in 1986, and since then, more than 185,000 cases have been diagnosed in the world, including in the US. But don't panic, there were only 5 confirmed cases in the US from 2003 to 2017. Now, interestingly, mad cow disease is not transmissible from cow to cow. Betsy can't give it to Daisy by licking her face, okay? It's contracted through contaminated cattle feed. Contaminated, unfortunately, by other cows with mad cow disease. You see, the parts of the cow that we don't eat are cooked, dried, and ground into a fine powder. I'm going to call it cow dust because that sounds ridiculous. So, what do we do with cow dust? Well, it's actually used for a bunch of things. And I'm absolutely not going down that rabbit hole, but one of the things that cow dust is used for is cow feed. I guess we force cows to become cannibals. Huh. So, if cows get infected by feed contaminated by other sick cows, how did the original cow get sick? Well, remember, it's a mutation. So, a cow one day had a mutation that caused prions to fold over and it made the cow sick. He or she was ground up into cow dust, mixed into cow feed, and boom, more infected cows. And when those cows die, turned into cow dust, put into more feed, exponential growth. It's the same as sheep and goats, but we call that one scrapie. And for deer and elk, we call it chronic wasting disease. But that one gets a fun nickname too. We also call it zombie deer disease because the affected animals will stagger and lower their heads and become dull and then drop dead. They would essentially wander around like zombies until they collapse. Can we cure animals with prion diseases? No, No, we can't. And apparently, the prions survive after death, as proven by how cow dust made from a cow that was affected by the prion disease can transmit it to others, right? So, to kill the prions, we need to denature the protein. We need to kill it with fire. But the bigger question here, and maybe the one you've been wondering since I started mentioning all these animals, can humans get sick from eating meat from an animal affected with prion disease? Well, actually, yes. But it's super, super rare. We don't know much about scrapie or chronic wasting disease, but there are reported cases of us humans contracting the human form of mad cow disease from eating diseased cattle. We call it CJD, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Now, CJD, like all the others, is a fatal, rapidly progressing prion disease. You don't only get it from cows, though. You can get it through consuming infected brain tissue or through contaminated blood, like if you got an infusion that was contaminated. In the UK, 5 people have become infected with CJD through contaminated blood transfusions, which sucks. But you can also get CJD from eating infected beef. It's rare, but it happens. So, what happens then when there's a population of cows that are suspected to have or confirmed to have mad cow disease? We don't want to risk getting an 100% fatal brain disease, right? Well, we kill off the entire population, whether they have it or not, and we burn them. The peak of mad cow disease, or at least the epidemic, in the UK was from 1992 to 1993. And in this time, there were more than 100,000 confirmed cases just in that 1 year period. In cows, not humans. Jesus Christ, can you imagine? But because we can't really get data except by autopsying dead cows, the UK didn't want to take the risk, and so 4.4 million cows were slaughtered. Today, mad cow disease is super rare, especially in the US. In fact, most cases of mad cow disease have been in the UK and Europe more generically. So, again, if you're an American, please don't panic. If you're in Europe, don't panic also. It's not as common as it was back in the 90s. But as we know, it's not just eating infected cattle that can give you prion diseases. You can also get it from eating the infected brains of humans. And that, my friends, brings us back to the Kuru, Papua New Guinea, and the Fore people. Now, the Fore people engaged in what we call ritual cannibalism, not survival or subsistence cannibalism. In fact, they had a pretty varied diet, so they didn't need to eat each other for survival. So, what about their culture and beliefs led to ritual cannibalism? Well, it's actually pretty interesting. It's something so foreign to Western principles that it's hard to stomach. Pun intended. First, it's important to note that it's typically just the women and children who contracted Kuru, not the men. Anthropologists, when they stumbled upon this, tried to figure out what could be causing the laughing sickness. Why only the women and children? First, they tried genetic testing. Was there something genetically passed down through the Fore that caused this, mother to child? But they didn't find anything abnormal. But then they looked into the Fore's burial practices. In many Fore villages, when a person from their community died, parts of their body would be cooked and consumed. Now, to us in the West, we immediately go to like Jeffrey Dahmer, right? But no, it wasn't done as a form of violence. It was meant to be a sign of love, grief, and mourning. As crazy as it sounds to us, to people like the Fore and other groups who engage in funerary cannibalism, this was a better alternative to burying them in the ground. In a 2007 article on the history of Kuru, M.P. Alpers wrote that, quote, the mortuary practice of consumption of the dead and incorporation of the body of the dead person into the bodies of living relatives helped to free the spirit of the dead. This practice had deep significance for the Fore peoples and their neighbors. End quote. Another word for this act is transumption, and transumption was common in the South Fore group. In a 2008 article on mortuary rites of the South Fore, the authors noted that, quote, in the Kuru affected region, all methods of disposal of the body involved being eaten. If the body was buried, it was eaten by worms. If it was placed on a platform, it was eaten by maggots. The Fore believed it was much better that the body was eaten by people who loved the deceased than by worms and insects. By eating the dead, they were able to show their love and to express their grief. This ritual allowed the soul to be recycled within the family and for the loved ones to receive blessings, which they believed would strengthen their own soul. End quote. Summarized more succinctly, it was better to lovingly consume the dead than to have worms or maggots eat them underground. But the problem for the Foray is that somewhere along the line, one of the disease community members had a prion disease. Women and children were primarily responsible for preparing the body for the funeral, and as they did so, they would eat brain tissue and the membranes around the brain. And in consuming that, they contracted the prion disease too. And as they died, more women and children preparing the body for the funeral consumed more tainted brain tissue, and they got sick as well. Now, the men would engage in funerary cannibalism as well, but they mainly ate muscle tissues, the good stuff, right? A lot more protein, I suppose, than the brain. But that stuff wasn't infected with misfolded prions. Only eating the brain tissue and the membrane transmitted the disease, so only the women and children got sick, and the cycle continued. Now, the peak Kuru years for the Foray were the 1950s and the 1960s. The government put a ban on cannibalism in 1959, and the Foray people, for the most part, stopped transumption, and this slowed down Kuru until it more or less disappeared. It was getting really complicated, though. As women and children were dying, there was a gender disparity in society. They were changing structures, right? And because it was mostly women getting sick, they would be accused of witchcraft. It was a whole big mess. I'm going to do you a favor and not get into the nitty-gritty of how they prepared the body. It was a long ritual that took days. It involved burning the body and purifying themselves with it and grinding bones down and cutting holes into the skull to scoop out brain. You know what? I just said I wasn't going to do that. I'm sorry. I'll stop. It's pretty gross, though. Now, this practice, which I've called ritual cannibalism and funerary cannibalism, is also sometimes called endo-cannibalism. Lots of words for eating your loved ones. And the Foray weren't the only group who developed this practice in isolation. The Wari of the Amazon in South America did the same thing. They roasted the remains of their dead and ate them. It was considered a non-violent means of helping their spirit pass on while strengthening the soul of the community. I mean, personally, no thanks. Just cremate me and sprinkle me around a tree, please. Don't turn me into human dust and use my remains to feed other people. Thanks. A small tangent, because I love tangents. The Fore, with their endo-cannibalism, aren't the only group of cannibals in Papua New Guinea. The Korowai tribe practiced ritual cannibalism too, but it wasn't to honor their dead. It was a form of punishment and retaliation against those who wronged them. But they, too, stopped this practice over time, though some anthropologists believe that they may still occasionally practice ritual cannibalism to this day. Now, because I think it's cool, and I want to talk about it, other indigenous groups have legends of stories about cannibalism too, and the one I'm thinking about in particular is the Wendigo. If you're a gamer or into watching Let's Plays on YouTube, you might remember the Until Dawn series that came out a few years ago. Oh my god, it came out in 2015. That was 9 years ago. Time is weird. Anyway, when you get older, time makes less and less sense. I'm just going to put that out there. Okay, so 9 years ago, when Until Dawn came out, which repopularized the myth of the Wendigo, it got some of the facts wrong. So let's talk about it. The Algonquin Indigenous Americans, who live primarily around the Great Lakes region here in the upper US and in Canada, tell the story of the Wendigo, a supernatural being associated with winter. He's not a cool supernatural being, though. He's a beast who stalks and eats humans. Sometimes he's portrayed as a spirit who possesses humans and turns them into cannibals. Now, the first Wendigo, according to folklore, was a hunter who turned to cannibalism during a particularly brutal winter for survival, which turned him into a beast that stalked and ate other humans or forced them to become cannibals as well. Now, this jives really well with Algonquin lore. This is also the basis for one of the subplots in the game I mentioned, Until Dawn. But if we take a step back, which is what I like doing as a big picture historian, the Wendigo is more than just creepy folklore, right? The fact that the Algonquin peoples even have this lore is a testament to the presence of cannibalism. It's the historical context, right? Why do they even have legends of cannibal beasts stalking and eating their prey, possessing them and turning them into cannibals? Because cannibalism must have existed there. But given how brutally cold the winters are in the northern Canada and US, or I should say the northern US and Canada, I would wager a bet that it was more so survival cannibalism, not the ritual cannibalism we see with groups like the Fore and Papua New Guinea. But you know what is similar about them? If you eat people, you're going to get infected with something, and it's going to be a bad time. Thanks for joining me for this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelly Beard, and I hope you've enjoyed the story of the Kuru Cannibal Disease. Thank you for supporting my podcast, and if you haven't checked out my other episodes, go have a listen. You can also support me and the show on Patreon. Just look up A Popular History of Unpopular Things, or APHOUT, APHOUT, and join as a cannibal, an explorer, or a historian. So if you want extra content, or if you just want to be lovely and support me, check out my Patreon and subscribe to me on YouTube. Just right below, click on that link. Be sure to follow my podcast, available wherever you listen, so you know when new episodes are dropped. And stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things.